The following video contains real war stories. It contains graphic descriptions and mature language. The views and opinions expressed within do not represent the ones held by Interpo's finest. Viewer discretion is advised. It was one of the bloodiest wars the 20th century has ever seen, characterized by extreme religious polarization, unbelievable amount of violence, huge human losses, and many horrendous stories to tell. When you tell some people what comes into your mind when someone says the 80s, they might say the TV show Dallas and JR's Machiavellian wheeling and dealing. They might say Larry Bird versus Magic Johnson. They might say perestroika and the beginning of political openness in the Eastern Bloc. But if you would have told some Iraqis or Iranians the same questions, they would answer blood, death, and sorrow. You'll see how can political ambition of a few rally the masses and obliterate their awareness through controlling every citizen's heart, mind, and soul. It is the Iraq-Iran War. In this video, we'll talk about the causes of the war, what happened from the military side and combat support side, which is the financing, domestic, and foreign support, the post-war situation, and what lessons could we draw from such conflict. In the end, for entertainment purposes, we made a quiz for the viewers who might want to test what they have learned from the video. The Iranian Revolution, which took place in 1978, had a largely Shiite religious dimension and aimed to establish an Islamic republic. After its success, the Iraqi Ba'ath regime was terrified of the possibility of its arrival in Iraq, especially since a large segment of the Iraqi people were followers of the Shiite sect, while most of the leaders in the Ba'ath Party regime were Sunnis and followed the secular approach of governing. The conflict over the Shatt al-Arab, a waterway linking the two countries to the Gulf of Hormuz, where commercial ships were docked, began during the 60s of the 20th century between the Iranian monarchy of the Shah and the then Iraqi regime, when Iran violated the 1937 treaty concluded between the two countries, which gave Shatt al-Arab to Iraq. The Shah of Iran ceased to pay the tax on the use of the waterway to the Iraqis, and his argument was that the concluded treaty was unfair, while also taking advantage of Iran's military superiority over Iraq. A limited armed border conflict broke out between the two countries in 1974, and at the same time, Iran was supporting the separatist Iraqi Kurds to a significant extent, which disturbed the Iraqi regime. The intensity of the conflict decreased after that, and an agreement was signed between the two countries in 1975 in the Algerian capital, which stated that Iraq and Iran would share the Shatt al-Arab in exchange for Iran ceasing its support for the Iraqi Kurdish separatists. The Iraqis were not satisfied with the agreement though, but a Kurdish rebellion was much more dangerous than the loss of Shatt al-Arab, and so they were forced to sign it. Before the Iranian Revolution, Iran was a major regional military power, as it enjoyed both American and Israeli support, and the Iranian intelligence service at that time, called Savak, spread terror in people's hearts. After the revolution, many of the competent and distinguished officers and military leaders loyal to the Shah's regime were executed, and those who weren't executed were removed from the army. This weakened the Iranian military leadership's efficiency, and with the United States and the West continuing to ban various military and security cooperation agreements, with the new government of Ayatollah al-Khomeini, it led to a decline in Iran's military capabilities, which was one of the reasons for Saddam Hussein's invasion. Called it Saddam's Qadisiyya after the Islamic conquest of Persia in the 7th century, the then Iraqi president Saddam Hussein ordered his army to invade Iran on September 22, 1980, where he ordered the seizure of the cities of Khorramshahr and Abadan by launching air strikes on the Iranian Air Force's positions to weaken it and launching a violent ground intervention in the same way. This plan resembles Israel's plan of the 1967 war. The Battle of Khorramshahr was the first and most violent battle of the invasion era, as the Iraqi forces succeeded in controlling the city, but at a very high cost, as the losses of both sides amounted to between 3,000 dead and 14,000 wounded. After the battle, the city was named Hunin Shahr, which means the city of blood in Persian, due to the fierce fighting that took place between the combatants throughout the city. At the same time, the Iraqis besieged the city of Abadan, and Saddam ordered an advance toward the city of Ahvaz and Dezful. Despite the success of the Iraqi forces in controlling Khorramshahr and besieging the cities of Ahvaz and Dezful, they suffered huge human losses amounting to tens of thousands of soldiers and military personnel. As the Iranian counterattack began on November 28, 1980, they launched a violent air and sea bombardment on the advancing Iraqi forces, which led to the weakening of 80% of Saddam's navy forces. When the cities were besieged, both sides began to dig trenches on the city's outskirts, similar to those witnessed in World War I, and trench warfare began. 90% of Iraq's strategic supplies were consumed or destroyed, and Saddam announced that he would move from an offensive to a defensive position. Saddam thought that Iran would not be able to withstand his imposing army, which had 800,000 soldiers, but he made a mistake in his estimation, as Iran launched counterattacks on the besieged city of Dezful on January 5, 1981, and launched a sudden air bombardment on the H-3 air base inside Iraqi territory, destroying 48 warplanes. In 1982, it liberated the city of Dezful on March 28th and the city of Khorramshahr on May 28th of the same year. These counterattacks were characterized by human wave attacks, where wave after wave is sent until the enemy is crushed. This is an old war tactic, and with the development of military equipment and technology, this tactic became obsolete. But with the lack of modern weapons that the Iranian forces were suffering from due to the Western blockade on them, these suicide waves became their only solution to repel and defeat the aggressor Iraq. On June 20th, 1982, the Iraqi president announced his intention to conclude a peace treaty and proposed a full ceasefire and a complete withdrawal from Iranian territory within 2 weeks. Through this statement, Khomeini felt Iraq's weakness and Iraq's fear of the Iranians and declared that the war would not stop until the Iraqi Ba'ath regime was overthrown. The Iranian religious regime began to encourage the Iranians to prepare to invade Iraqi territory. After the liberation of Khorramshahr, Dezful and Abadan, and Khomeini's rejection of Saddam's proposal for a ceasefire, Iran invaded Iraq at the end of June 1982, as it attacked the Iraqi city of Basra on July 13, 1982, to control the Shatt al-Arab waterway, which was one of the main reasons for the outbreak of the war, and it launched a military operation called Operation Muharram in November of the same year, whose purpose was to liberate border cities under Iraqi control, such as the southern cities of Muzien and Dehloran. Both attacks were failures, and Iran was unable to achieve its goals and suffered losses estimated at 16,000 dead soldiers and the destruction of approximately 400 tanks. In 1983, Iran failed during its offensive operations for the second time in a row, as it failed to control the Feka oil field in southern Iraq during operations called Before Dawn and Dawn 1 between February and April. After that, the war was transferred to the Kurdistan Governorate in northern Iraq, and it succeeded in controlling the city of Erbil during Operation Dawn 2 in July 1983. The year 1984 came, during which Iran launched one of its largest operations during the war. It was called Operation Dawn 5, which targeted the city of Basra, and Operation Khaybar, which targeted the Majnoon oil fields. The first operation was a failed attack, while the Khaybar operation was successful for the Iranians, and they were able to control the oil fields, but they suffered very heavy losses, as 20,000 Iranian soldiers were killed, while 30,000 others were wounded, and 1,000 of them were captured. After its miserable failure in its invasion of Iran, Iraq's offensive capabilities declined, as it was no longer able to launch another invasion like the one it did in 1980, and its only recourse was to take defensive positions plus launching lightning strikes across the sea and air. It focused a lot on naval strikes and often targeted Iranian oil tankers and tankers from other countries. Analysts point out that the reason Iraq targeted Iranian tankers was due to their attempt to weaken the Iranian oil-dependent economy, plus their attempt to provoke Ayatollah al-Khomeini into closing the Strait of Hormuz, through which at that time the strait controlled 50% of the global oil trade. This would lead to America's intervention alongside Iraq to try to reopen it, as America has repeatedly threatened to intervene if the Iranians closed it. Iraq was the first to launch naval strikes, targeting more than 10 oil tankers of various nationalities in 1984, blaming it on the Iranian naval forces in an attempt to gain external support. Iraq's continued inability to launch ground attacks, in addition to the constant insults that Khomeini received from Saddam Hussein on Iraqi television channels.
احنا نقول للخميني الخميني يجوز يزعل من كلمة دجال، الدجال مربع. هذا النظام دجال شرير مشبوه غير إسلامي. شلون نظام إسلامي هذا ما ينطي أسماء الأسرى؟ إذا الخميني ما يدري معناه هو إنسان ما يصلح للحكم، هو شخص أول بالدولة، شلون ما يدري؟ وإذا يدري معناه هو لو ما يؤمن بالإسلام لو لا يفهم الإسلام. هذا النظام قائم على الدجل، قائم على الشعوذة، وما فرد يوم الدجل والشعوذة غلبت الحقيقة. وكلمة دجال ما عاد بس العراقيين يقولوها، صاروا الإيرانيين يقولوها. الآن المعارضة الإيرانية تسميه الدجال. يعني شلون تطلع بجرايدكم انتو خميني الدجال، هم يقولون خميني الدجال.
Motivated Iran to launch more attacks on Iraqi defenses. In 1985, Iran attempted to seize the highway linking Baghdad and Basra in March, which was called Operation Badr, in reference to the Battle of Badr that Muslims fought against the Quraysh tribe. The operation initially succeeded to a large extent, but with the successive Iraqi counterattacks, the Iranians were forced to withdraw. The most prominent operation carried out by the Iranians' armed forces in the entire war was Operation Dawn 8, whose purpose was to seize the strategic Al-Fawz Peninsula. On February 10, 1986, it launched an amphibious landing on the peninsula, specifically on the Shatt al-Arab region, and eliminated all the Iraqi forces that were protecting the waterway. Fierce battles continued between the two armies until the Iraqis abandoned the peninsula and the Iranians took control of it on March 10th of the same year. The Battle of Al-Faw was characterized by unparalleled violence in previous years of war, as Iraq used chemical weapons in violation of international texts and laws of war that prohibit the use of this type of weapon. The death toll between the two sides was estimated at about 48,000 people, most of them Iranian victims of the chemical attack. The loss of Al-Faw Peninsula in 1986 was a very painful blow to the Iraqis, and Kuwait's fear of an Iranian invasion began to grow due to Al-Faw's proximity to Kuwaiti territory, as it was only 10 kilometers away. With the constant interference of Saddam Hussein in military decision-making, who did not have any previous military experience, the generals' anger at him increased, and they threatened a full-scale rebellion against the ruling Ba'ath Party if they were not given complete freedom in planning and decision-making. In the end, the Iraqi president reluctantly accepted their demands and under his general's advice created a militia called the Popular Army Forces. To this extent, the goal of the ruling elite in Iraq was to regain Al-Faw at any cost. Its strategic importance lies in the fact that it is the only Iraqi area overlooking the sea, and with the Iranians' control over it, Iraq became landlocked and without seaports, which undermines its commercial operations with the outside world. In order to regain it, the Iraqi generals prepared a plan to attack and seize the southern border city of Mehran, hoping a negotiation with the Iranians would be exchanged with the Al-Faw Peninsula. Iraq succeeded in controlling the city in May 1986, but instead of negotiating, the Iranians launched a counterattack and liberated it in June 1986. The Iranians did not accept their series of failures in bringing the city of Basra under their control, and despite the strategic importance that the city possesses, as it is considered the largest city overlooking the Shatt al-Arab waterway, they did not despair and remained persistent and launched another military operation on the city called Operation Karbala 4 in late December 1986. They failed again in achieving their goal. Then, the Iranians realized that Iraq would not give up an inch of Basra, to the extent that Saddam ordered the execution of some of his officers who had violated some of the orders of the military leadership in the First Battle of Al-Faw and Operation Karbala 4.
ما هو الطريق؟ القتال. القتال حتى النصر. دفاع عن الوطن وعن الشرف حتى النصر بعون الله.
Stuck between the hammer of defeating Basra and the anvil of prolonging the war, despair began to creep into the psyche of Iranian soldiers, and the person possessed by despair either abandons his goals or seeks to achieve them in brutal ways, as he becomes like a mad dog who destroys anything in his way and eats green and arid lands. And indeed, the desperate Iranian machine launched the most violent attack of the war, as it repeated the attack again on the city of Basra under the name Operation Karbala 5. This was the largest and the last massive attack carried out by the Iranian army in Iraq during the war, as they besieged the city for 3 months with scary artillery bombardments and human wave attacks, estimated at 200,000 soldiers. 70% of the infantry division were the elites of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. With the lack of equipment and the deterioration in its economic situation, the Iraqi army did not have a walk in the park, but it fought back and launched massive counterattacks on the enemy's artillery. The Iraqi Army Command ordered its soldiers to not withdraw under any circumstances and no matter the cost, as Iraq had 300,000 soldiers plus artillery teams from the Iraqi Republican Guard, who were considered the crème de la crème of the Iraqi armed forces. Luck smiled again at the Iraqi army as it succeeded in breaking the siege of Iranian forces that lasted 3 months and forced them into an eventual bitter withdrawal. The siege of al-Basra was the most violent siege of the war, and historians often compare it to the Battle of the Somme in World War I, which they consider to be the most violent battle of that war. The losses of both sides were estimated at about 50,000 dead and 9,000 wounded, and about 2 million Iraqis were displaced from Basra Governorate and the near regions. What about the naval confrontations I talked about at the part 1? Well, between 1984 and 1987, the Iraqi and Iranian naval forces continued to launch strikes on oil tankers of different nationalities, each blaming the other in order to avoid international scrutiny. After losing the coastal city of Al-Faw in 1986, Iraq lost all seaports to which it could resort to export its oil, and with Syria stopping the export of Iraqi oil to the Mediterranean via oil pipelines located on its territory due to its support of Iran, Iraq relied heavily on Kuwait to transport its black gold, and as a result, Iran began attacking Kuwaiti tankers carrying Iraqi black liquid, which prompted Kuwait to request American intervention to protect it. And indeed, the United States began Operation Earnest Will on July 24, 1987, to protect oil tankers from all different nationalities from naval bombardments of Iran. Iran responded to this operation by deploying sea mines along the Persian Gulf and deploying small boats instead of large warships to harass Kuwaiti tankers. The failure in the Karbala operations and the attempt to control the strategic city of Basra was a strong blow to the psyche of the Iranian leadership, and with the decline in popular support for the war, Iran's military capabilities declined, whether defensive or offensive, as it was no longer able to launch other attacks or hold on to the cities or regions it had previously won in the war. The frustration was similar to that which befell the Iraqis after losing the Al-Faw Peninsula. Thrilled by their resilience in the face of Iranian attacks on Basra, Saddam moved from the defensive to an offensive position.
توكل على الله ابو عبد الله. يا عافية بس أهم شيء من يحجم عندكم اتجاه لا تقفون. يعني شاغلوا وطوروا الاتجاه اللي ينجح بديكم.
And with the beginning of 1998, Iraq began to renew its military equipment and increase the number of soldiers to 1 million, as the former American general Norman Schwarzkopf indicated that by the year 1998, Iraq had the fourth largest army in the world.
I had studied the area and we had come to the conclusion that the worst case scenario that we would have to face would be Iraq. I mean, Iraq had the fourth largest army in the world at that time. They had just won major victories against the Iranians. They had modern military equipment. And so when you looked around at the area and said, you know, who is the worst enemy that you'd have to fight over there? It was Iraq.
As a result, the Iraqi army began preparing to launch a lightning attack to retake Al-Faw Peninsula. The Army Command ordered military maneuvers near Al-Faw that mimicked what it was planning during the attack. 100,000 soldiers were prepared, and reports indicate that 60% of them were members of the Republican Guard specialized in protecting presidential facilities and Saddam's family. At the same time, Saddam Hussein implemented shock and awe tactics in his attacks on Iran and on his own people. For example, on March 16, 1998, according to international law, Iraq committed a war crime called the Habalja massacre in northern Iraqi Kurdistan, where the Kurdish civilians, led by the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan and the Kurdistan Democratic Party, were bombed and massacred. Iran was also attacked with chemical weapons in the same region, which according to security reports published after the war, the massacre left between 3,000 and 5,000 dead and 9,000 civilians injured. The Iraqi forces began the sweeping, sudden, and lightning attack on the Al-Faw Peninsula on April 17, 1988, at 5 in the morning, armed with 1,000 tanks, 1,400 artillery, and 1,300 armed vehicles. The attack was accompanied by airstrikes using chemical weapons launched by the Iraqi Air Force.
وهذا هو عهدنا بهم، احنا ما نتوقع منهم الا مثل هذه النتائج الكبيره ان شاء الله. ودوما ان شاء الله يكونون بالصوره اللي يرضاها شعبهم ولهم. بارك الله فيك عبد الواحد. بعون الله بعون الله. بعون الله لا إن شاء الله العلم عرفاه وأنت لازم ترفعه أنت ورواد.
With the decline in performance and equipment of the Iranians, they were surprised by the majestic performance of the Iraqis and were unable to regroup themselves in order to launch a counterattack. With these successive terrifying attacks by the Iraqis, the Iranian army was forced to withdraw, and the Iraqis regained the Al-Faw Peninsula on April 18th, after only 1 day from beginning of the attacks. After the victory in the Second Battle of Al-Faw, Saddam Hussein realized that the Iranian army was on the run and were not able to launch further attacks in the future. So he took advantage of the opportunity and launched a military operation in order to expel the Iranians from the Iraqi territory. It was called Operation Tawakkalna ala Allah, and in English, We Trust God, as it was based on the Blitzkrieg principle and was characterized by speed and surprise, and eventually succeeded in expelling the forces of Ayatollah Khomeini from Iraqi soil. After the loss of Al-Faw Peninsula and Operation We Trust God, in addition to the lack of equipment and the decline in popular support, those close to Ayatollah Khomeini's circle began to pressure him to accept the calls of the Security Council, calling for an end of the war and a ceasefire, especially Resolution number 598, issued on July 20th, 1987. But before that, the rebellious MEK party that opposed the Iranian religious regime took advantage of the opportunity before a UN resolution was implemented to launch a lightning attack accompanied by Iraqi support with equipment and intelligence. It was called Operation Internal Light. On July 26, 1988, the MEK party attacked Iran border cities and succeeded with Iraqi air support in controlling the cities of Karand Gharb and Islamabad Gharb. This achievement allowed them to penetrate far into Iran and control the highway linking Baghdad and Tehran. The MEK's series of victories did not last long, as the Iranian army responded with a counterattack on July 29th, taking advantage of the party's lack of equipment and the lack of field experience of its fighters, bombing their positions from the air and besieging them in the city of Karand Gharb on the same day. On July 31st, the MEK party withdrew from Iranian territory. In response to their attack, the Iranian regime executed the party's political prisoners in Iranian prisons, although there is no accurate number, but estimates say that the number exceeds 3,000 prisoners. This operation was the last operation witnessed in the Iran-Iraq War. United Nations Resolution number 598 entered into service on August 8, 1988, and peace was established between the two countries on August 20, 1988. The United Nations peacekeeping forces assumed the peacekeeping mission until 1991. Because of its marginalization of the Shiite and Kurdish communities, the Ba'ath Party worked to gain their support in various ways, whether soft or hard. In an attempt to gain the Shiite support, Saddam Hussein allowed more Shiites to join the Ba'ath Party and the government, even though leadership positions were still dominated by the Sunnis. From a cultural standpoint, the Iraqi government restored the tomb of Ali ibn Abi Talib, a sacred figure among Shiites in particular, and the fourth caliph in Islam, and the cousin of Prophet Muhammad, with marble imported from Italy, while also it improved the living standards of Shiites, which were lower than their Sunni counterparts. But on the other hand, he practiced some repression against the Iranian-backed Shiites, such as the 1982 Dujail incident, where he held more than 140 people in prison and executed them in retaliation for a previous assassination attempt by the Iranian-backed Shiite Islamic Dawah Party against them. As for the Kurds, in order to win their support, the government also improved their standards of living by building schools and hospitals and filling countryside roads with asphalt in the city of Erbil. But voices denouncing the war among them were also suppressed. Perhaps the most prominent example is what we saw before, the Halabja massacre. The Soviet Union, China, and France together accounted for more than 90% of the value of Iraq's arms imports between 1980 and 1988. During the war, Iraq was viewed by the West and the Soviets as a counterweight to post-revolutionary Iran, as it was supported by more than 15 countries, but the main ones were the Soviet Union, the Gulf states, France, and the United States. The Soviets, Iraq's main arms supplier before the war, did not want to end their alliance with Iraq and were alarmed by Saddam's threats to find new arms suppliers in the West and China. And some, in Kremlin circles, wished to use these threats as leverage to form an alliance with Iran. Although, at the end of the war, the Soviets doubled their arms sales to the Iraqi armed forces and became their largest arms suppliers in that period. The United States was not very enthusiastic in supporting Iraq and was largely active in helping to prevent an Iranian victory. Former U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger described the U.S. establishment's view of the war perfectly, as he said, "It is unfortunate that both countries can't lose. Therefore, American support has included several $billion in economic aid, the sale of dual-use technology, military intelligence, and special operations training." The U.S. also removed Iraq from its State Department's list of state sponsors of terrorism to facilitate the sale of dual-use technology. The Iraqi government financed its war through its oil revenues and foreign loans from the Gulf states. Political analysts believe that the Iranian government saw the war as an opportunity to gain popular legitimacy and also to strengthen and consolidate the revolution led by Ayatollah Khomeini. Due to the nature of the theocratic state in Iran, the most impressive thing the Iranian government did was to glorify martyrdom among Iranian children.
من مهداد عزیزاللهی نظامی از اصفهان هستم که 14 سالمه و انگیزه که باعث شد به جبهه بیام واقعا اون برادرایی که قبلا جبهه بودن.
الان که تو گروه تخریب هستی چی کارا کردی تو این مدت هشم؟
تو این مدت البته ما هیچ کاری نکردیم. هر کاری که میشد اون کار خدا میکرد. ما فقط وسیله بودیم و همین حالا که ما داشتیم با موتور از خط میومدیم یه خونپاره تقریبا 5 متری ما خورد. قشنگ برمزی که موجش ما رو تکون داد ولی ما هیچ یک ترکش هم نخوردیم و ما فقط وسیله در این جبهه خودمون هیچ کاری ضعیفیم در مقابل این قدرت ها و اینا فقط خداست که ما رو یاری میکنه.
Which made it easier for the Iranian fighting forces to rely on human wave attacks to a very large extent during the war. Also, the Iraqi aggression gave Iran an opportunity to play the role of the victim and gain popular sympathy, as Ayatollah Khomeini issued a fatwa declaring that what Iran is doing is a holy jihad, and every citizen must contribute with his capabilities to repel the aggression of, according to Ayatollah, the apostate Ba'ath Party. But after the year 1987, and especially after the failure of the siege of Basra, popular support for the war declined, and it was seen that waging war was not important, especially after the success of the Iranian army in removing its Iraqi opponent from Iranian territory. Anti-government movements emerged, such as the pro-Iraqi Kurds, in addition to a number of student unions and the MEK party, as the latter attempted assassinations of a significant number of senior Iranian politicians around Khomeini, the most prominent of which was the assassination of President Mohammad Ali Raja'i on August 30th, 1981, along with his Prime Minister Mohammad Bahnir using a booby-trapped briefcase. But soon, these rebellions were suppressed in a brutal and horrific manner, as thousands of them were arrested and tortured, some were executed, and the rest were sentenced to life imprisonment. The most prominent countries that helped Iran in the war were Israel, North Korea, Libya, and Syria. Before the revolution, most of the armament of Shah's Iranian forces came from the United States and Israel, and after the revolution, the US imposed an arms embargo on Iran. This greatly weakened Iran as it needed Western-made spare parts and war equipment because it matched its previous equipment before the revolution. The American embargo decision led Iran to search for other arms markets in the Eastern Bloc countries, knowing that it received several offers from other neutral countries such as Argentina and Portugal, and North Korea was the main intermediary in many arms deals concluded between the countries of the Communist bloc and the Islamic Republic of Iran. Despite its public opposition to it and the cutting of diplomatic relations with it, Iran received significant and secret support from Israel, as the latter sold military technical equipment, dual-use technology, and medium-range missiles.
والخميني مو رجل دين. اللي يوصفه بأنه رجل دين ولأنه رجل دين متعصب وغبي لا يفهم في السياسة فهو واهم. الخميني سياسي، والخميني عندما يدرك أنه يخسر أكثر مما يربح يقيم السلام حتى وهو حي وبقرار منه، لأن الخميني استخدم السياسة في كل ميدان، ويا الإسرائيليين استخدمها واشترى السلاح بقرار منه.
Iran accepted the support because the majority of Israel's equipment depends on Western technology, and this matched Iran's previously owned material before the revolution. As for Israel, the reason for its secret support for Iran, despite cutting diplomatic relations with it and Iran's withdrawal of recognition of the State of Israel in the United Nations, was due to two reasons. First, Israel's fear of Saddam's expansionist ambitions, as it was embodied during its airstrikes on the Iraqi nuclear reactor located southeast of Baghdad in 1981, and saw Iran as a counterbalance for such ambitions. Secondly, some political elites in Israel adopted the policy of the former Prime Minister Ben-Gurion, which aimed to build alliances with non-Arab Islamic countries because he viewed the conflict between Palestine and Israel as between Arabs and Israelis, and not between the Muslims and Israelis. He saw that there was no need to quarrel with the non-Arab Islamic countries such as Turkey, Iran, and some Kurdish factions. It is worth stating that the US also secretly supported Iran until 1985 by selling weapons despite its strong support for Iraq. The reason for this was due to America's desire to reach an agreement with the Iranian-backed Hezbollah, which previously had kidnapped 7 Americans during the Lebanese Civil War.
ويا الأمريكان لقى عدد من المليارات لعبوا بقضايا الرهائن ثم أطلقهم بقرار منه. فهو سياسي، لكن سياسي يقيم الحسابات على أساس ما يربح وما يخسر.
And with that money obtained from selling weapons, the US government supports a rebel movement in Nicaragua called the Contras. This support was illegal according to American laws because Iran was under an American embargo. This issue became an embarrassing scandal in the American media known as the Iran-Contra affair.
Iran-Contra connection. Iran-Contra scandal.
And major investigations began throughout that time in this subject.
My fellow Americans, I've said on several occasions that I wouldn't comment about the recent congressional hearings on the Iran-Contra matter until the hearings were over. Well, that time has come, so tonight I want to talk about some of the lessons we've learned. I know you have doubts in your own minds about what happened in this whole episode. What I hope is, not in doubt, however, is my commitment to the investigations themselves. So far, we've had 4 investigations by the Justice Department, the Tower Board, the Independent Counsel, and the Congress. I requested 3 of those investigations, and I endorsed and cooperated fully with the 4th. As the Tower Board reported, and as I said last March, our original initiative rapidly got all tangled up in the sale of arms, and the sale of arms got tangled up with hostages. Secretary Shultz and Secretary Weinberger both predicted that the American people would immediately assume this whole plan was an arms for hostages deal and nothing more. Well, unfortunately, their predictions were right.
In an attempt to resolve the conflict through diplomatic channels and dialogue, both Iraq and Iran sent their diplomatic representatives to the Swiss city of Geneva to begin peace talks. As a result of its dependence on Western support and in violation of Security Council Resolution 598, Iraq refused to withdraw its forces from disputed territories until Iran recognized Iraq's sovereignty over Shatt al-Arab waterway, hoping to win at the negotiating table what it couldn't win in the battleground. As a result, Iran refused to liberate Iraqi prisoners, who were estimated at 70,000 Iraqi soldiers compared to 40,000 captured Iranian soldiers. It also rejected the stoppage of its naval blockade on Iraqi ports, although its effect was limited due to Iraq's dependence on the ports of neighboring countries such as Kuwait and Jordan. With the advent of 1990, Saddam Hussein began accelerating his conciliatory approach with the then Iranian President Rajafzani, as they agreed to restore diplomatic relations and return to the Algiers Agreement previously concluded in 1975. The Iran-Iraq War was the most violent war witnessed in the 80s of the last century, and with the manipulation of statistics carried out by both countries in inflating the number of its victims and reducing the enemy's losses for the purpose of propaganda and winning sympathy from the international public opinion, several international neutral agencies estimated the human losses for both sides at between 1 million and 2 million people, both civilians and military personnel, including the dead, the wounded, and prisoners who sat in merciless dungeons. As for the total economic losses, reports indicated that the losses of both parties together exceeded $1 trillion, plus the halt of the domestic development tire and infrastructure projects. Iraq was the most affected country by this war, as its total debts exceeded $130 billion without taking into account the interest incurred on it. The largest percent of the debts was attributed to the Gulf states, such as Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. After the war, Iraq sought to work with Kuwait to clear a large portion of its debts, but the latter refused, accusing it of increasing oil production to reduce its prices on the international market, which wasn't profitable for Saddam. So Iraq invaded Kuwait on August 2, 1990. On the other hand, Iran sought war reparations and compensations for its losses, but its request was never heeded. As we saw in the section of military side, international law was violated several times during the war. Several international courts prosecuted those involved on charges of committing war crimes and crimes against humanity, not with a judicial motive, but with a political motive, as some political analysts point out.
هالخطبة وهالسياسية احنا محكمة جنائية محكمة قضائية ملنا دخل بمسائل السياسة فلان شكل ولعنة على فلان جاوب على الإفادة.
هي لو مو السياسة ايش جابنا هنا وايش جابك انت هنا؟ هذه مو محكمة، هذه
محكمة قانونية محكمة عراقية قانونية
لعبة.
Perhaps the most prominent trial of someone involved on the Iraqi side was the trial of Saddam Hussein and some of his aides by the Iraqi court after he fell into the hands of American occupation of Iraq in 2003, where he was prosecuted on charges of committing war crimes and crimes against humanity by giving orders to the Iraqi forces to commit massacres against his own people. One against the Kurds in March 1988 and the second against the Shiites loyal to Iran in 1982. The court recognized his involvement in those massacres, and he was executed on December 30th, 2006. On the Iranian side, the most prominent trial that took place was the trial of a person named Hamid Nouri, a former prison guard who belonged to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. He was charged with participating in the extrajudicial execution of political prisoners affiliated with the MEK party. He was arrested at the airport in the Swedish capital Stockholm and was brought to justice in the same country. The court acknowledged his involvement in the charges, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment on July 14, 2022, 34 years after the incident. After repelling the Iraqi attacks between 1980 and 1981, Saddam announced his intention to ceasefire and return to the state of peace. But Khomeini did not accept this and insisted on continuing the war until the overthrow of the Iraqi regime. And this harmed him in the long run, as most of the Iranian attacks failed to reach their goals, and this led to the morale decline of the Iranian people, who have been exhausted by the duration of the war and who did not find any reason to invade Iraq. After the Iranian Revolution of 1979, which led to a somewhat weakening of the Iranian forces after the execution of many distinguished generals and the decline of Western support for them, Saddam was encouraged to start the war, thinking that it would not last long, but he failed in his estimations, as the Iranians fought fiercely and were able to turn the tables from a defender to an attacker. Because of his mistake, Saddam opened the gates of hell for his Iraqi people. Perhaps the most important reason for Iranian superiority in resisting the invasion of Iraq, despite the Iranians' lack of equipment and their loss of many competent officers, is the popular support the Iranian armed forces received from their society. Iranian citizens did not hesitate at all to send their children and loved ones to the front lines.
These people here, these people who come here to fight, they just, they've left their families. They've left their houses. Just they want to come here just to fight the Iraqis. But your country is now helping Iraq, right? But why? You see these people? How old is he? How old is this guy? Must be 14 or something. But he's come here to fight. He's left his mother, he's left his father.
Because they thought that they would die defending what was the most precious to them, their honor, their religion, and their homeland. After the Iranian invasion of Iraq, popular support decreased, as they did not find any reason to enter Iraq because the enemy was so far from their homes, and the Iranian soldiers suffered heavy losses. Often, popular support for the war increases when citizens' fear of the possibility of the enemy reaching their lands is big. The greater the fear and the possibility, the greater the support. And as long as the war is far from home, more people hate to participate in it, unless it was short.